Welcome to Obsessed with Assessment podcast. In this newsy episode, we're going to be delving into the school's SEN crisis following a damning report in October 2024 from the National Audit Office. We're going to think about the implications of this for inclusive assessment.
You've started there with some strong words already, with crisis and damning. So
I'm trying to go in like a journalist. I'm Sam Deno. I've been working in education for 14 years in and outside the classroom. My latest role is that of assessment detective.
that's an official job title, of course.
It is. And my co-investigator is Emma McHale.
Hello. I have been a primary teacher for 12 years and I've been at Twinkle for the last 3 full time. Before that, interestingly, I did work in an SEN setting, so I am quite interested in seeing what we come up with today.
Back in 2014, the Department for Education introduced the Children and Families Act, which, among other goals, set out to reform SEN provision in education with the objective to improve outcomes for children and young people with special educational needs. One of the DFE's goals was to make mainstream schools more inclusive in order to ease the burden on special schools, and because mainstream education, and I quote, provides them the best start in life and is most cost effective.
The phrase cost effective being used to talk about schools and SEN education already sets my teeth on edge.
Along came the National Audit Office, who have the joyful responsibility of investigating government programs in order to determine whether return on investment is being achieved. So they explore an area of spending, they produce a report, and they make recommendations for change if and when appropriate. This is what they say about the DFE's approach to SEN since the Children and Families Act. Since 2019, there has been no consistent improvement in outcomes for children and young people with special educational needs. And alarmingly, they say that the DFE does not know with confidence how much capacity should be planned and where to meet future needs.
Okay.
So, as part of the Children and Families Act of 2014, EHCPs, Education, Health and Care Plans, were introduced. In 2015, there were 240,000 young people with EHCPs. By 2024, this has risen to 576,000.
That is a huge increase.
A lot's happened, hasn't it? We've had pandemic. We've had cost of living crisis,
and I guess an increased awareness of need, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, and to break that 576,000 down, most of the increase in EHC plans between 2018, 2019, 2023 and 24 related to autistic spectrum disorders, speech, language and communication needs, and social, emotional and mental health needs.
Yeah, definitely. Just that feels like a list of things that we have an increased awareness of, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It does. But then suddenly you've got an SEN and inclusion crisis, haven't you? Because, well, we're not answering the questions that those 576,000 EHC plans pose to the education industry. Spending has increased in real terms across the programme. So across those 10 years, there has been a 58% increase in expenditure. But obviously, as more and more ECHPs are written, funding per plan has actually fallen by 35%. So
yeah, that's interesting. Per pupil is very interesting, isn't it, though?
The National Audit Office concludes then, this is from their report, the current system is not achieving value for money and is unsustainable, and that the government needs to think urgently about how its current investment can be better spent, including through more inclusive education. We've got the curriculum and assessment review around the corner, in fact, ongoing as we record this episode. Things look likely to change. And of course, a big part of the curriculum assessment review is inclusivity, and it is looking at SEND, and it is looking down, breaking the barriers to opportunities for children born into more disadvantaged backgrounds. So hopefully we're on the edge of something more hopeful, to use the same word again. Just in terms of, though, the data that I've just shared, is this a concern for all educators in England? Well, yes, it is, because actually roughly 55% of young people with EHCPs during this period have been in mainstream school settings. So inclusive curriculum and assessment is important for everyone, for every school setting. Bizarrely, Ofsted offers no separate judgment on a school's special educational needs provision within its reports.
I remember that blowing my mind when I'd first started teaching, that even in like, you know, in the actual SEND provisions, like full educational units, there was still, the Ofsted judgments were still kind of around the same structure. You know, I knew somebody at the time who worked in a special needs school that had a range of need, and those children, they were still being asked to report on who had met, you know, end of Key Stage 2 expectations in the SATs, which is just mad.
The National Audit Office report found that DFE assessments of school performance emphasise academic attainment over broader measures of progress. And they conclude schools are not incentivised to be inclusive, with an inclusive culture often depending on schools' leadership. So schools at the moment are only inclusive because they want to be, not because policy tells them to be, but because out of the kindness of their hearts. So what does that look like at the other end of the education sausage machine then?
I love it.
A survey in 2021-22 found that 85% of non-special educational needs 18-year-olds had gone into higher education, apprenticeships or employment after leaving school. The figure for SEN 18-year-olds is just 69%, which is pitiful.
Yeah, it could have been lower and I still wouldn't have been shocked, I think, actually, which is even sadder.
That's the SEN crisis. What can we do about that in the day-to-day? Well, obviously, we can't make policy change ourselves. The day-to-day teacher can't change educational policy and governmental policy. But in terms of day-to-day, Natalie Packer is an independent education consultant and author, including she co-authored a book this year called Beyond Boundaries, which is about SEN provision in trusts. And so I'm borrowing some of her advice here for teachers working in mainstream settings. So ultimately her point is that it boils down to assessment being used meaningfully and usefully. Packer points out that one of the most important purposes of assessment is to celebrate progress and to share successes with the child and their parents.
Yeah, very easy to say how far behind an expected standard a child is, isn't it?
It's crazy. We use assessment to beat people over the head and to say, are you hitting the standard? Are you hitting the standard? When actually we could and should be using it to say, well done, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've mentioned this before. Like, I am the parent of a child who is on the SEND register, and one of my favourite things that happened to her school is that, you know, at those parents' evening, that's what we get. Like, this is the progress she's made against what she was doing the last time we assessed her, rather than reporting on age-related expectations, which I think is so much better.
Packer lists pupil attributes which could be tested to ensure holistic, inclusive assessment. And she says, assess their communication skills, assess their social skills, their mental health, their physical development, their independence, their resilience. If we go for academic every time, then of course these young people are going to fail.
If I'm being even more idealist, why are we not assessing all children against those? Would be would be the next question anyway.
Here's some advice that I've taken from Natalie Packer in terms of formative assessment and then summative assessment. So in terms of formative assessment, often when dealing with young people with special educational needs, we need to be mindful that the steps they make in their progress will be smaller than the steps that other learners make. So in order to assess big and small steps effectively, we need to be really, really clear about the purpose of the learning and what the end goal or goals should be. And again, that is like, well, of course, that's what a teacher should be doing. And of course, that's what a teacher should be doing for their whole class.
Yeah, particularly pertinent to somebody who you know isn't going to meet necessarily the goals for, like you say, their age.
Yeah. Day-to-day formative assessment. And this is a drum we keep on banging. We'll just say it again. It allows the teacher to establish what the starting point for a particular child is and what the next steps should be in terms of progress and in terms of teaching strategies. Teachers should use a range of assessment approaches, and that's something that echoes actually an Ofsted framework idea that range variety of assessment is the most effective in a classroom because you're meeting all sorts of needs all at once. Get to know your Senko and approach them for ideas and strategies.
I think this is probably a little bit different between primary and secondary, because I always wondered that, because obviously a secondary tends to have a bigger staff base. So whereas, like, I was at a primary school that was 2 form entry, so it wasn't small, but even then the staff's not so many that you wouldn't have necessarily known the Senko.
This is important. Be mindful of your pupils' ability to understand you effectively and tailor your written and verbal feedback accordingly. So you might be working with young people that don't have very good literacy skills. They might not understand your written feedback. You might be working with young people that don't have very many verbal skills. So how are you going to communicate them? And you have to be mindful of that as you.
I remember somebody shouting that at a training meeting in my very early days of teaching. Like, why are you writing all the feedback? They can't even read.
That sounds wonderful.
It was true, wasn't it? If you put it in front of a child who can barely read like a couple of CVC words, they're not going to read the feedback you've added for them, are they?
Yeah. And then in terms of summative assessment, senior leaders need to, well, okay, so we're not all senior leaders, unfortunately, but senior leaders need to ensure that their tracking system for measuring progress offers teachers the opportunity to track pupils regardless of their start point or end point. Some pupils will fail to reach their age-related expectations, but they may still be making amazing progress relative to where their learning begins. It's definitely worth checking out the inclusion area on the Twinkle website.
Yeah, it's very inclusive. There's a lot of things on there.
Yeah, extensive and exhaustive.
Great words.
And then finally, teachers setting summative assessments need to consider, is it appropriate in this situation? Actually, is it going to help my SEND kid, or is it going to hinder their progress? What adjustments need to be put in place if you are going ahead with a summative assessment? Do formal arrangements need to be made via the Senko? Obviously, with high stakes testing, yes, but what about lower stakes testing as well? Is it worth a conversation with the Senko? What needs to be communicated to the student and to their parents? All sorts of things to think about, aren't there?
I think there's so many things to think about with regards to assessing children who are never going to meet an age-related expectation. So, yes.
Following these strategies will not, obviously, solve the SEN crisis in the education sector, but they can make the journey for your students smoother, and hopefully with a positive an optimistic attitude. Hopefully they create a consistent transition into what is a better system at the end of the curriculum assessment review. We love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so please get in touch and tell us if any of this has been valuable to you. You can email us on assessment@twinkle.co.uk. Please like and subscribe to the podcast, and it's bye for now.
Goodbye.